Hello, thanks again for tuning in. I'm the Honest Author, and today I'll be reading from my latest work, The Haunting of Grosvenor House. This is my paranormal cozy mystery, which includes an investigative medium who has reached the end of her storied career, or so she thought. If you're unaware, investigative medium is a subgenre that blends supernatural, psychic, mediumship abilities with a mystery or detective fiction. In these stories, a clairvoyant protagonist works alongside law enforcement or independently to solve murders, locate missing persons, and uncover dark historical secrets. This novel has it all. What I will read you today is an introduction to a main character, not the medium, but another character who you will become intimately familiar with and who will carry the story forward. So dim the lights, fire up a candle, make a tea or pour a glass of wine, and rest easy in your favorite chair because you're about to meet Jessie. Chapter 1, Jessie. I've always been good at being invisible, forgettable, indistinguishable from the wallpaper. I often feel like I'm simply haunting the world I inhabit, an enigma both to myself and the world. It's cringeworthy to be me, and although I'm well into my final year of university, my lack of interest in societal norms remains unchanged. However, a new development is looming, something dangerous, something tangible I can cling to, something to solve. But at what cost? As a youth, I was diagnosed with selective mutism, a side effect, they said, of my first 4 years of silence. As a result, I became unusually observant of others. I learned about the world through observation rather than engagement, and by studying how people carried themselves, whether their shoulders sank after an insult or their chests puffed out like proud roosters upon receiving a compliment, conveying their emotions without making a sound. I also noticed how expressions changed, even subtly, such as a raised eyebrow or a slight flinch, to convey mood, and how insecurities crept into conversation. When I finally decided to speak, and I'm not entirely sure it was a decision rather than an impulse that overtook me, my vocabulary surprised my bourgeois parents. They cried together as I watched their newfound pride wash the despair from their eyes. I had compiled a dictionary's worth of words at 4.5 and presented them in short, brilliant stanzas, or so they told their friends, saying, "I told you so, and I said it wouldn't last forever." Not long after this milestone was reached, I would learn that my sudden, overwhelming need to talk did not lend itself to making friends. It was as if I spoke a different language from the other kindergartners. They shied away from my big words and left me alone. I felt like an alien amongst them, alienated. That's when I decided to halt the progress my parents saw in me and stop talking, to become invisible, forgettable, at one with the wallpaper. Since then, I've felt invisible for most of my life. My mother loved me while my father tolerated me. My father never understood why I might stop speaking. Was it something he'd done? Something he'd said? It wasn't. But the breakthrough they'd witnessed had abruptly ceased, and Dad was visibly upset over it. "I have nothing to say," I would insist. "But people want to hear from you, Jessie. Your opinions matter," my mother would intercede. "I don't have opinions," I would rebut. Of course, that wasn't true. I did have opinions. My head swam with them, analyzing how others spoke and what they spoke about. Gossip bored me. In my view, it was the lowest common denominator in human relations. Why talk about someone else when you could avoid it altogether? And I avoided it, like the plague. I wouldn't answer the other kids if they asked me about another student. I refused to participate in the unqualified assumptions of the other 8-year-olds who thought Mickey liked Jules or presumed that Jane was from a house with 2 mothers and Jackson never washed his hair. Ugh, so tedious and unnecessary. It wasn't worth opening my mouth to prove them wrong. It was barely worth a shrug. Of course, this kind of disinterest in what kids were saying further distanced me from them. Eventually, they stopped sharing their misguided assumptions with me and started talking about me. Jesse is weird, some said. Jesse can't talk. He can't hear. He's stupid. Jesse is retarded. He isn't even human. Well, they could say whatever they wanted. It was merely erroneous gossip with no basis in fact. Still, I wasn't without feelings, and I cried myself to sleep countless times over the cruel opinions of my peers, even if I was the cause of it. So I became more callous. Locking my feelings away, I conducted experiments on my peers to avoid feeling utterly disconnected from the world. My earliest memory of intentionally interrupting the norm was pinching a girl in grade 3 and slipping between two classmates, making her believe one of them had pinched her. They were both oblivious to my cunning, and the girl, Alana, glared at them angrily. The boys looked at one another and shrugged. It was so easy to manipulate people, I thought, as I enjoyed a private laugh at my classmates' expense. My mother would later describe the sensation as butterflies in my tummy because the prank was so agreeable. In fact, I liked the sensation so much that I repeated this disturbance several times that afternoon. Soon the girls were talking in tight groups, gossiping about which boy had been pinching them. They were all wrong. The feelings that followed were complicated, as I felt clever for evading their suspicions, but invisible because they hadn't even considered me the villain. It was as if I had become a ghost. So, invisible became my norm, and throughout my student career, I remained mute to most. My report cards repeated the same commentaries. Jesse is encouraged to seek teacher feedback. Jesse is withdrawn. Jesse is quiet and shy. Jesse should strive to establish connections with his classmates. Jesse should join a club. High school proved relentless, as it does for anyone lacking the necessary social skills. When I was asked to join the D&D club, a group one might think would appeal to someone with such an aversion to every other organized club, I shook my head and walked away. It wasn't that I felt superior. Instead, I felt so detached that the idea of spending hours battling mythical creatures in a sparsely furnished, unfinished basement filled with the smell of body odor, soda, and Cheetos alongside my peers made no sense, intellectually. I knew how this sounded, but it was not something I could control. Disconnected. That's how I felt about the world. It made sense. I didn't question why I felt this way. I wasn't making any effort to be connected, as most people did. So why would I feel any different? It didn't bother me. I no longer went home and cried over the cruelty of others. I didn't feel anything about it. It was what it was. I was bullied from time to time, but my lack of reaction offered little satisfaction to those performing the bullying. Without a whimper or an attempt to fight back, bullies received no dopamine, and so became less interested. My life became increasingly programmed around conducting my experiments. As I attended every school dance, every award ceremony in the gym, and every social event alone. My trials in these social situations brought back the butterflies I'd become dependent on. Everyone I'd gleaned a reaction from breathed new life into me. My private joke. Something as simple as a dead stare from the corner of the gymnasium during a dance when a couple was engaged in a kiss paid dividends to my sensory bank once they realized my attention was directed at them. In one scenario, a boy named Richard approached me after his girlfriend, Diana, noticed that I was noticing them. "Can I help you?" Richard snarled, his face just inches away. We both stood 6 foot tall and could see into one another's eyes. Richard was a member of several sports teams, and by all accounts, he enjoyed the life afforded him by participating in those elite social clubs. I, of course, said nothing in reply, even if I'd wanted to, and I didn't. I couldn't have responded. I met Richard's stare without emotion, without a trace of expression. "Maybe you should leave," the jock scoffed. But I was frozen in place. Being found out was my drug. It was what gave me all the feels. I wasn't going anywhere. Richard, becoming enraged by my lack of reaction, shoved me. Although I'm no athlete, I barely budged at the two-handed push. I was no slouch. I rivaled Richard's athletic frame, weighing 200 pounds in my senior year. In addition to the zero response to a suggestion that I leave, This refusal to budge further amplified Richard's anger. He stepped back to size me up. I felt the impact of Richard's fist slam into my broad jaw, head snapping to the side. The sensation was new, but admittedly not unsolicited. I was no stranger to pain. I'd been cutting since I was 9. I had been pinching and punching and slapping myself for years to petition feelings. Oddly, none had produced an emotional reaction in the mirror where I'd stand, applying the technique and waiting for an expression other than my trademark deadpan to play out across my pale face. Now, I'll stop there and leave the results of Jesse's experiment to your imagination. That is, until you pick up the book. I hope you do, as you can find it across multiple online booksellers and in print via Amazon. So thanks for listening, and happy reading.